Okay, I'm back. Reality, however, was quick to intrude on McCandless's reverie. He had difficulty killing game, and the daily journal entries during this first week in the bush included weakness, snowed in, and disaster. He saw but did not shoot at a grizzly on May 2nd, shot at but missed some ducks on May 4th, and finally killed and ate a spruce goose on May 5th, but he didn't shoot anything else until May 9th, when he bagged a single small squirrel, by which point he'd written fourth day famine in his journal. It seems like it's turning out to be a little harder than he thought it would be. But I will say this, it was smart that he didn't shoot at a grizzly with a 22, because I think that would just make the grizzly mad. But soon thereafter, his fortunes took a sharp turn for the better. By mid-May, the sun was circling high in the heavens, flooding the Tago with light. The sun dipped below the northern horizon for fewer than 4 hours out of every 24, and at midnight the sky was still bright enough to read by. Everywhere but on the north-facing slopes and in the shadowy ravines, the snowpack had melted down to the bare grounds, exposing the previous season's rose hips and lingonberries, which McCandless gathered and ate in great quantity. He also became much more successful at hunting game, and for the next 6 weeks feasted regularly on squirrel, spruce goose, duck, goose, and porcupine. On May 22nd, a crown fell off of one of his molars, but he didn't even seem to dampen his spirits much, because the following day he scrambled up the nameless hump-like 3,000-foot butte that rises directly north of the bus, giving him a view of the whole icy sweep of the Alaska Range, and mile after mile of uninhabited country. His journal entry for the day is characteristically terse, but unmistakably joyous. Climb mountain. McCandless had told Gallion that he intended to remain on the move during his stay in the bush. I'm just going to take off and keep walking west, he said. I might walk all the way to the Bering Sea. On May 5th, after pausing for 4 days at the bus, he resumed his preambulation. From the snapshots recovered from his Minolta, it appears at his camera. It appears that McCandless lost or intentionally left the by now indistinct Stampede Trail and headed west and north through the hills above the Shoshana River, hunting game as he went. It was slow going. In order to feed himself, he had to devote a large part of each day stalking animals. Moreover, the ground thawed. His route turned into a gauntlet of boggy muskeg, an impenetrable adler. And McCandless belated, came up to appreciate one of the fundamental, if counterintuitive, axioms of the North. Winter, not summer, is the preferred season for traveling overland through the bush. Faced with obvious folly of his original ambition to walk 500 miles to Tidewater, he reconsidered his plans. On May 19th, having traveled no farther west than the Tucklot River, less than 15 miles beyond the bus, he turned around. A week later, he was back at the derelict vehicle, apparently without regret. He decided that the Shoshana drainage was plenty wild to suit his purposes at that Fairbanks Bus 142 would make a fine base camp for the remainder of the summer. Ironically, the wilderness surrounding the bus, the patch of overgrown country where McCandless was determined to become lost in the wild, scarcely qualifies as wilderness by Alaska standards. Less than 30 miles to the east is a major thoroughfare, the George Parks Highway. Just 16 miles to the south, beyond an escarpment of the outer range, hundreds of tourists rumble daily into the Denali Park over the road patrolled by the National Park Service. And unbeknownst to the aesthetic voyager, scattered within 6-mile radius of the bus are 4 cabins, although none happen to be occupied during the summer of 1992. But despite the relative proximity of the bus to civilization, for all practical purposes, McCandless was cut off from the rest of the world. He spent nearly 4 months in the bush, all told, and during that period he didn't encounter another living soul, and the end of the Shoshana River site was sufficiently remote to cost him his life. In the last week of May, after moving his few possessions into the bus, McCandless wrote a list of housekeeping chores on the parchment-like script of birch bark. Collect and store ice from the river for refrigerating meat. Cover the vehicle's missing windows with plastic. Lay in a supply of firewood. Clean the accumulation of old ash from the stove. And under the heading long term, He drew up a list of more ambitious tasks, mapped the area, improvise a bathtub, collect skins and feathers to sew into clothing, construct a bridge across a nearby creek, repair a mess kit, blaze a network of hunting trails. The diary entries following his return to the bus catalog a bounty of wild meat. May 28th, gourmet duck. June 1st, 5 squirrel. June 2nd, porcupine. Pterygium, 4 squirrel, gray bird. June 3rd, another porcupine, 4 squirrel, 2 gray bird, ash bird. June 4th, a third porcupine, squirrel, gray bird. On June 5th, he shot at a Canada goose as a big Christmas turkey. And then on June 9th, he bagged the biggest prize of all, moose, he recorded in his journal. For one thing, that's pretty impressive to kill a moose with a .22. Overjoyed, the proud hunter took a photograph of himself kneeling over his trophy, which you guys can find on Google. Rifle thrust triumphantly overhead, his features distorted in the rictus of ecstasy and amazement, like some unemployed janitor who had gone to Reno and won $1 million jackpot. Although McCandless was enough of a realist to know that hunting game was an unavoidable component of living off the land, he had always been ambivalent about killing animals. That ambivalence turned to remorse soon after he shot the moose. It was relatively small, weighing perhaps 600 or 700 pounds, but it nevertheless amounted to a huge quantity of meat. Believing it was morally indefensible to waste any part of that animal that had been shot for food, McCandless spent 6 days toiling to preserve what he had killed before it spoiled. He butchered the carcass under a thick cloud of flies and mosquitoes, boiled the organs into a stew, and then laboriously excavated and burrowed in the face of the rocky stream bank directly behind the bus, in which he tried to cure by smoking the immense slabs of purple flesh. Alaskan hunters know that the easiest way to preserve meat in the bush is to slice it into thin strips and then air dry it on makeshift rack. But McCandless, in his naivety, relied on the advice of hunters he had consulted in South Dakota, who advised him to smoke the meat. Not an easy task under the circumstances. Butchering extremely difficult, he wrote in the journal on June 10th. Fly and mosquito hordes. Remove intestines, liver, kidneys, 1 lung, steaks. Get hindquarters and leg to stream. June 11th. Remove heart and other lung. 2 front legs and head. Get rest to stream. Haul near cave. Try to protect with smoker. Remove half rib cage and steaks. Can only work at night. Keep smokers going. Get remainder of rib cage, shoulder, and neck to cave. Start smoking. June 14th. Maggots already. Smoking appears ineffective. Don't know. Looks like disaster. I now wish I had never shot the moose. One of the greatest tragedies of my life. At that point, he gave up on preserving the bulk of the meat and abandoned the carcass to the wolves. Although he castigated himself severely for his waste of life he had taken, a day later, McCandless appeared to regain some perspective for his journal notes. Henceforth, will only learn to accept my errors, however great they may be. Shortly after the moose episode, McCandless began to read Thoreau's Walden. In the chapter titled Higher Laws, in which Thoreau ruminates on the morality of eating, McCandless highlighted, when I had caught and cleaned and cooked and eaten my fish, they seemed not to have fed me essentially. It was insignificant and unnecessary, and cost more than it came to. The moose, McCandless wrote in the margin, and in some passages he marked, the repugnance to animal food is not the effect of experience, but is an instinct. It appeared more beautiful to live low and fare hard in many respects, and though I never did so, I went far enough to please my imagination. I believe that every man who has ever been earnest to preserve his higher or poetic faculties in the best condition has been particularly inclined to abstain from animal food, and from much food of any kind. It is hard to provide and cook so simple and clean a diet and will not offend the imagination. But this, I think, is to be fed when we feed the body. They should both sit down at the same table, yet perhaps this may be done. The fruits eaten temperamentally need not make us ashamed of our appetites, nor interrupt the worthiest pursuits, but put an extra condiment into your dish and it will poison you. Yes, McCandless wrote, and 2 pages later, conscious of food, eat and cook with concentration, holy food. On the back pages of the book that served as his journal, he declared, "I am reborn. This is my dawn. Real life has just begun. Deliberate living." Ooh, to live deliberately, where have we heard that before? Conscious attention to the basics of life and a constant attention to your immediate environment and its concerns. Example, a job, a task, a book. Anything requiring efficient concentration. Circumstance has no value. It is how one relates to a situation that has value. All true meaning resides in the personal relationship to a phenomenon and what it means to you. The greatest holiness of food, the vital heat. Positivism, the unsurpassable joy of the life aesthetic. Absolute truth and honesty, reality, independence, finality, stability, consistency. As McCandless gradually stopped rebuking himself for the waste of the moose, the contentment that began in mid-May resumed and seemed to continue through early July. Then, in the midst of his idyll, came the first two pivotal setbacks. Satisfied apparently with what he had learned during the 2 months of solitary life in the wild, McCandless decided to return to civilization. It was time to bring his final and greatest adventure to a close and get himself back to the world of men and women, where he could chug a beer, talk philosophy, and enthrall strangers with tales of what he'd done. He seemed to have moved beyond his need to assert so adamantly his autonomy, his need to separate himself from his parents. Maybe he was prepared to forgive their imperfections. Maybe he was prepared to forgive some of his own. McCandless seemed ready perhaps to go home. Or maybe not. We could do no more than speculate about what he intended to do after he walked out of the bush. There is no question, however, that he intended to walk out. Writing on a piece of birch bark, he made a list of things to do before he departed. Patch jeans, shave, organize pack. Shortly thereafter, he propped his Minolta on an empty oil drum and took a snapshot of himself brandishing a yellow disposable razor and grinning at the camera, clean shaven with new patches cut from an army blanket stitched onto his knees of his filthy jeans. He looks healthy but alarmingly gaunt. Already his cheeks are sunken. The tendons in his neck stand out like taut cables. On July 2nd, McCandless finished reading Tolstoy's Family Happiness, having marked several passages that moved him. He was right in saying that the only certain happiness in life is to live for others. I have lived through much now, and I have found what is needed for happiness. A quiet, secluded life in the country with the possibility of being useful to people whom it is easy to do good and whom are not accustomed to have it done for them. Then work which one hopes may be of some use, and then rest, nature, books, music, love for one's neighbor. Such is my idea of happiness. And then on top of all of that, you for a mate and children perhaps. What more can the heart of a man desire? Then on July 3rd, he shouldered his backpack and began the 20-mile hike to the improved road. 2 days later, halfway there, he arrived in heavy rain at the beaver ponds that blocked access to the west bank of the Tecanoleca River. In April, they had been frozen over and had presented an obstacle. Now he must have been alarmed to find a 3-acre lake covering the trail. To avoid having to wade through the murky chest-deep water, he scrambled up a steep hillside, bypassed the ponds on the north, and then dropped back down to the river at the mouth of the gorge. When he had first crossed the river 67 days earlier in the freezing temperatures in April, it had been icy but a gentle knee-deep creek. He had simply just strolled across it. On July 5th, however, the Tecanoleca was a full flood, swollen with rain and snowmelt from glaciers high in the Alaska Range, running cold and fast. If he could reach the far shore, the remainder of the hike to the highway would be easy, but to get there, he would have to negotiate a channel of some 100 feet wide. The water, opaque with glacial sediment and only a few degrees warmer than the ice it had so recently been, was the color of wet concrete. Too deep to wade, it rumbled like a freight train. The powerful current would quickly knock him off his feet and carry him away. McCandless was a weak swimmer and had confessed to several people that he was, in fact, afraid of the water. Attempting to swim the numbing cold torrent, or even to paddle Some sort of improvised raft across seemed too risky to consider. Just down the stream from where the trail met the river, the Technolika erupted into a chaos of boiling white water as it accelerated through the narrow gorge. Long before he could swim or paddle to the far shore, he'd be pulled into these rapids and drowned. In his journal, he now wrote, "Disaster, reined in, river look impossible, lonely, scared." He concluded correctly that he would probably have been swept to his death if he attempted to cross the Technolika at that place in those conditions. It would be suicidal if it was simply not an option. If McCandless had walked a mile or so upstream, he would have discovered that the river broadened into a maze of braided channels. If he had scouted carefully, by trial and error, he might have found a place where these braids were only chest deep. As strong as the current was running, it would have certainly knocked him off his feet. But by dog paddling and hopping along the bottom as he drifted downstream, he could have conceivably have made it across before being carried into the gorge and succumbing to hypothermia. But it would still have been a very risky proposition, and at that point, McCandless had no reason to take such a risk. He had been fending for himself quite nicely in the country. He probably understood that if he was patient and waited, the river would eventually drop to a level where it could be safely forded. After weighing his options, therefore, he settled on the most prudent courses. He turned around and began walking west, back towards the bus, back into the fickle heart of the bush. Okay, guys. So, over the next week, finish this book. There's not much left to it. You got 2 chapters left. I would read the epilogue, too, because it's very sweet how his parents dealt with, and because his parents go visit the bus. And it's just very sweet to read, and I would try reading that. But next week, I will email your tests to you. It'll be, like I said, over the entirety of the study guide. And I'll just ask you to write a few paragraphs about some kind of theme in the book. It won't be too exorbitant because I know it's hard to do this when we don't do our self notes or when we don't do our class notes where we do like devil's advocate and stuff like that. I'll get a hold of you guys next week. I'll read the test to you and everything. And this sucks. And I really miss you guys. And I really wish I could have read this entire book with you and talked to you about it. Because it's like my favorite part of teaching is talking to you guys. And I haven't got to do that in a couple of months. And I hate it. But anyway, before old Macaulay gets too emotional, I'll let you guys go and I'll talk to you next week. And like I said, anytime you guys need anything or if you just want to talk about stuff, feel free to, you can even call me on Google Hangouts. But I'll talk to you guys next week, okay?